March 15th, 1944. 6,000 meters above the cloud-choked skies of northwestern Germany, Oberst Heinrich Vogel peered through the observation window of his command bunker, watching another formation of American heavy aircraft pass overhead without releasing a single payload. The clouds were so thick today that even the silhouettes were barely visible, just dark shapes moving through an ocean of grey. For the third consecutive day, the enemy formations had circled, searched, and ultimately turned back toward England, with their ordnance still secured in their bays. Vogel allowed himself a thin smile as he turned to his deputy, Hauptmann Franz Müller. "You see, Müller, nature herself protects us. Let them waste their fuel." What neither man could know in that moment of confidence was that in less than 72 hours, their entire understanding of modern aerial warfare would collapse in a rain of high explosive ordnance so precise that it would seem to defy the very laws of physics they thought governed combat. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how German military leadership learned, in the most devastating way possible, that human eyes had become obsolete in the new age of technological warfare, and how American innovation transformed invisible radio waves into the most feared weapon in the European theater. The synthetic oil plant at Gelsenkirchen-Scholven was not merely another industrial facility. By early 1944, it had become the single most critical petroleum production center in all of German-occupied Europe, refining more than 40,000 barrels of synthetic fuel daily. Captain Robert Henderson of the 391st Bombardment Group had studied the intelligence photographs until he could navigate the facility blindfolded. Every pipe, every distillation tower, every storage tank was committed to memory. But Henderson's expertise meant nothing when confronted with the reality of northwestern European weather. "Sir, meteorology confirms solid cloud cover from ground level to 25,000 feet, his navigator, Lieutenant James Morrison, reported during the mission briefing on March 16th. Visibility expected at exactly 0 meters. Henderson looked at the assembled air crews of the 8th Air Force, 23 heavy aircraft crews, representing more than 250 young men preparing for a mission that conventional wisdom declared impossible. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the briefing room, "what I'm about to tell you will sound like something from a science fiction magazine, but I assure you, it's as real as the aircraft you'll be flying today." The technology that Henderson described had been developed in the laboratories of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, refined by engineers at the Radiation Laboratory, who worked 18-hour shifts to transform theoretical physics into practical warfare. The H-2X radar system, called by those who understood its significance as the device that would make weather irrelevant, utilized microwave radiation to create images of the ground below, regardless of cloud cover, darkness, or atmospheric conditions. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, the radar operator Henderson had trained with for 6 weeks at a classified facility in England, tried to explain the technology to his skeptical bombardier. "Think of it like this, Matthews. We send out radio waves that bounce off buildings, roads, rivers, anything solid. The return signal creates a picture on my scope. I can see the target as clearly through clouds as you could see it on a sunny day." "That's impossible," Bombardier Second Lieutenant Richard Matthews replied. "Radio waves can't create pictures." "6 months ago I would have agreed with you," Bradley said quietly, "but I've seen it work. I've watched entire cities appear on my scope, like ghosts emerging from fog." While the American air crews prepared for their mission, Oberst Vogel was receiving his own briefing at the Gelsenkirchen facility. The officer from the Regional Air Defense Command brought concerning intelligence from Berlin. "Sir, our sources indicate the Americans have developed some form of new targeting system. Details remain unclear, but there are reports of accurate strikes through complete cloud cover." Vogel dismissed the concern with a wave of his hand. "Propaganda to justify their failures. I've commanded air defense for 26 months. I know what aircraft can and cannot accomplish. Without visual reference, there is no accuracy. This is basic physics, not subject to American innovation." Muller, younger and perhaps less certain, ventured a question. "But sir, what if they have developed something we don't understand?" The Americans have substantial industrial resources for research. Resources don't overcome the laws of nature, Vogel replied. An aircraft flying at 6,000 meters through solid clouds has no reference points. Even if they drop ordnance, the probability of hitting a specific facility is statistically negligible. We've calculated this extensively. The Americans know this as well as we do, which is why they don't even attempt such missions. The conversation reflected a broader confidence that permeated German military leadership in early 1944. Despite the obvious industrial superiority of the Allied forces, despite the endless streams of aircraft that filled European skies daily, there remained a conviction that certain fundamental realities of warfare remained unchanged. Gravity, visibility, human limitation. These were constants that no amount of American production could overcome. On the morning of March 18th, Captain Henderson's formation lifted off from their base in eastern England at precisely 0600 hours. The weather forecast had, if anything, worsened. Solid overcast from the English Channel to the heart of Germany, with cloud tops estimated at 30,000 feet in some areas. Traditional bombing doctrine would have scrubbed such a mission without hesitation, but the 391st Bombardment Group was no longer operating under traditional doctrine. "Bradley, how's your scope?" Henderson asked as they climbed through the thick morning clouds over England. The radar operator's voice came back steady and confident. "Receiving clear returns, Captain. I can see the coastline ahead, the channel, even individual ships in the water. This equipment is functioning perfectly." Henderson felt something he hadn't experienced in his previous 19 combat missions, a sense of control that transcended weather, transcended visibility, transcended the chaos that usually defined aerial combat. For the first time, he wasn't hoping to find his target. He knew he would find it. The formation crossed into German airspace at 0815 hours, completely invisible in the clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon. At Gelsenkirchen, Vogel received reports of aircraft engine sounds from his listening posts, but the acoustic detection network could only approximate direction and altitude. "They're circling again," he told Muller, "searching for a break in the clouds they'll never find. By noon, they'll be back in England, and we'll have another day of uninterrupted production." Inside Henderson's aircraft, Bradley was narrating the landscape below as though he could see it with perfect clarity. "Approaching the Rhine now, Captain. I'm seeing the bridge at Wessel, the rail junction at Dorsten. We're exactly on course, 32 minutes to target." Matthews, the bombardier who had been so skeptical during briefing, watched Bradley work with growing amazement. The radar scope showed a ghostly green image of the terrain below, updating continuously as they flew. Roads appeared as thin, dark lines, rivers as meandering gaps in the return signal, cities as complex clusters of bright echoes. "I'll be damned," Matthews whispered. "It actually works." The technology that made this possible represented a revolution in physics translated into engineering. The H2X system generated microwave pulses at a frequency of 9.7 gigahertz, wavelengths short enough to reflect off structures as small as individual buildings. A rotating antenna scanned the ground below, while sensitive receivers detected the returning signals and displayed them on a cathode ray tube. The entire system weighed approximately 650 kilograms and required its own dedicated operator, but it had effectively eliminated weather as a factor in aerial warfare. 15 minutes to initial point, Bradley announced. "I'm identifying the bend in the Emscher River. The canal system is showing clearly. There's the rail yard at Gelsenkirchen-Buer. Target should be visible in approximately 8 minutes." At the synthetic oil facility, workers continued their shifts with the calm assurance that the clouds overhead provided absolute protection. Production Superintendent Wilhelm Krause walked through the distillation complex, checking pressure gauges and temperature readings, entirely focused on the industrial process that kept German vehicles moving. The sound of aircraft engines was an almost daily occurrence now, an annoyance that no longer even merited looking skyward. "Target acquired." Bradley's voice was sharp with focus. "I have clear scope imagery of the Scholven facility. I'm identifying the primary distillation towers, the hydrogenation plant, the storage tank farm. We're approximately 6 minutes from release point. Recommend heading adjustment to 092 degrees. Henderson made the course correction, trusting instruments and information he couldn't verify with his own eyes. The entire formation adjusted with him. 23 heavy aircraft, moving in precise coordination through clouds so thick that each crew flew in complete isolation, unable to see the aircraft flying just 30 meters away. 3 minutes, Bradley continued. I'm tracking our approach path. The facility is centered in my scope. Wind calculation shows negligible drift. Recommend release in 2 minutes 40 seconds. What happened next would be reconstructed by investigators in the weeks that followed, piecing together evidence from damage assessments, survivor testimony, and the technical capabilities of the weapon systems involved. At precisely 0943 hours, the lead aircraft in Henderson's formation released its ordnance load. 8 500-kilogram high-explosive charges fell through 6,000 meters of cloud-choked sky, invisible to anyone on the ground below. The first explosion struck the primary hydrogenation plant with precision that defied statistical probability. The blast wave shattered pressure vessels containing superheated hydrogen gas, triggering a secondary explosion that could be heard 30 kilometers away. Before the workers in the facility could even process what was happening, the second aircraft's ordnance impacted the distillation complex. Then, the third aircraft's payload struck the storage tanks, then the fourth, fifth, sixth aircraft in a cascading sequence of detonations that transformed the facility from functioning industrial plant to burning wreckage in less than 90 seconds. Vogel felt the first explosion through the soles of his boots before he heard it. The command bunker, located 3 kilometers from the facility, shook as though struck by an earthquake. "What was that?" he shouted, already knowing the answer but unable to accept its implications. Miller was at the communications panel, receiving reports from observers throughout the region. "Sir, the Scholven plant is under attack. Multiple direct hits. The facility is reporting catastrophic damage." "That's impossible." Vogel's voice had lost its previous confidence. "They can't even see the target. The clouds." "Sir, I'm receiving damage reports from the entire facility. The hydrogenation plant is completely destroyed. The main distillation towers have collapsed. The storage tank farm is burning. They didn't just hit the facility, they hit specific structures within the facility." The impossibility of what Muller described was exactly what made it so devastating. Vogel understood bombing accuracy in terms of probability distributions and circular error probabilities. Even under perfect visual conditions, achieving direct hits on specific industrial structures required multiple aircraft and extensive ordnance expenditure. The idea that such precision could be achieved through solid cloud cover violated every principle of aerial warfare he had studied. Henderson's formation had already turned back toward England when the full scope of their achievement became clear. "Bradley, how confident are you in our strike results?" Henderson asked. "Captain, I watched every payload release and tracked the impact points on my scope. We achieved what I would assess as 90% accuracy on primary structures." This was a textbook demonstration of radar-guided ordnance delivery. When Henderson's crews landed back in England that afternoon, they were met by intelligence officers and technical specialists who had been waiting for confirmation that the new technology actually performed as designed in combat conditions. The photographic reconnaissance aircraft that flew over Gelsenkirchen the following day, when the clouds finally cleared, provided that confirmation. The Scholven facility, which had been producing 40,000 barrels of synthetic fuel daily, was reduced to smoking ruins. Production capacity, 0. But the strategic impact of that single mission extended far beyond the destruction of one facility. Within 72 hours, German military leadership was receiving reports of similar precision strikes through cloud cover across industrial facilities throughout occupied Europe. The pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. The Americans had solved the weather problem. Major General Klaus Weber, responsible for industrial defense coordination, convened an emergency conference in Berlin on March 22nd. The assembled officers represented the highest levels of German military intelligence and technical expertise. "Gentlemen, we need to understand what we're facing," Weber began. These aren't lucky strikes or coincidental accuracy. The Americans have developed a capability we didn't anticipate. The technical analysis that followed was thorough and deeply unsettling. German radar experts, working from fragmentary intelligence and battlefield observation, concluded that the Americans had successfully miniaturized radar technology to the point where it could be carried aboard individual aircraft and used for ground mapping and targeting. The implications were staggering. "This changes everything," one intelligence officer stated flatly. "Our entire defensive strategy has been predicated on the assumption that weather provides natural protection. If the Americans can target through clouds with this level of accuracy, then no facility in occupied Europe is safe, regardless of meteorological conditions." Weber understood that the problem extended beyond mere tactical considerations. German industrial production was already strained to its maximum capacity, struggling to replace losses that mounted daily. The ability to protect critical facilities during poor weather had been one of the few remaining advantages. Now even that was gone. The psychological impact on German military personnel was perhaps as significant as the tactical implications. Oberst Vogel, who had been so confident that nature herself protected his facilities, submitted his resignation on March 25th. "I assured my superiors that the Scholven plant was secure," he wrote in his final report. "I based that assessment on what I believed were immutable principles of aerial warfare. I was wrong, and that error resulted in the loss of our most critical fuel production facility. Someone else will need to defend against an enemy that can see through clouds." Muller, promoted to replace Vogel, approached his new command with none of his predecessors' confidence. "We're facing an enemy that has fundamentally altered the rules of engagement," he told his staff during his first briefing. "Our previous assumptions about visibility, weather, and targeting accuracy are now obsolete. We must adapt or accept continuous destruction of our industrial capacity." The adaptation that followed was desperate and largely ineffective. German engineers attempted to develop countermeasures, from chaff dispensers meant to confuse radar returns to elaborate camouflage schemes that proved useless against microwave radiation. Industrial facilities were dispersed when possible, moved underground when feasible, but the pace of American raids far exceeded the pace of German defensive adjustments. Captain Henderson flew 12 more missions using the H-2X radar system before being rotated back to the United States in June 1944. By that time, the technology had been integrated throughout the 8th Air Force's heavy bombardment groups, and similar systems were being deployed in the Pacific Theater. "I remember the first time I explained to my crew how radar bombing worked," Henderson recalled years later in an interview. "They thought I was describing science fiction. 3 months later, it was standard operating procedure. That's how fast warfare was evolving." Lieutenant Bradley, the radar operator whose calm narration had guided that first precision strike through the clouds, became an instructor, training hundreds of other operators in the technology that had rendered weather irrelevant. "The most satisfying part wasn't just the technical achievement," he explained to his students. "It was watching the enemy's confidence collapse. They had built their entire defensive strategy around weather protection, and we took that away from them in a single mission." The strategic impact of radar-guided precision bombing on the outcome of the European conflict cannot be overstated. By late 1944, German synthetic fuel production had been reduced to approximately 15% of peak capacity, not through lucky strikes or overwhelming ordnance expenditure, but through systematic targeting of specific facilities with precision that would have been impossible using traditional visual bombing methods. The mobility of German military forces, already constrained by Allied air superiority, became critically limited by fuel shortages that stemmed directly from the success of radar-guided strikes. The technological revolution that the H-2X system represented extended far beyond its immediate military application. The radar mapping techniques developed for bombing through clouds would later evolve into civilian technologies, ranging from weather forecasting to geological surveying to air traffic control. The engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Radiation Laboratory, working under intense wartime pressure, had created capabilities that would transform multiple fields of human endeavor. But in March 1944, In the skies over Gelsenkirchen, the significance of the technology was measured in more immediate terms. Wilhelm Krause, the production superintendent who had been walking through the facility when Henderson's ordnance arrived, survived the initial explosions by taking shelter in a reinforced control room. Emerging into the wreckage of the plant he had managed for 3 years, he tried to comprehend what had happened. "I never saw the aircraft," he told investigators later. "I never heard the ordnance falling. I was checking temperature readings, and then the world exploded around me. In 30 seconds, 3 years of work was reduced to burning metal. And through it all, I never saw a single aircraft. They were completely invisible above the clouds." That sense of helplessness, of being struck by an enemy one couldn't even see, became a defining characteristic of the final year of the European conflict. German military personnel and industrial workers learned to fear clear skies and cloudy skies equally, because the Americans could strike with precision under any weather conditions. The psychological burden of knowing that no weather pattern provided protection contributed to the progressive collapse of morale that characterized German forces in late 1944 and early 1945. Müller, commanding the air defense sector that included Gelsenkirchen, watched his responsibilities become increasingly futile as the months progressed. "We're placing listening posts, we're coordinating observer networks, we're attempting to predict strike patterns," he wrote in his personal diary in August 1944. "But ultimately we're trying to defend against an enemy that has achieved a level of technological sophistication we cannot match. They see what we cannot see, they strike what they choose to strike, and we simply endure the consequences." The final irony of Vogel's confident assertion that nature herself protected German facilities came in February 1945, when American formations struck the few remaining functional industrial plants in Western Germany during a period of perfect visibility. The strikes were accurate, devastating, and entirely unnecessary. The same facilities could have been destroyed with equal precision through clouds, through darkness, through any weather conditions whatsoever. The clear skies simply made the photographic evidence more satisfying for the intelligence analysts who assessed the damage. When Henderson returned to the United States in late 1944, he was asked to speak at military academies about his experiences with radar-guided bombing. "The technology was impressive," he told one audience of cadets. "But what struck me most was how completely it invalidated the enemy's assumptions. They had built fortifications, they had positioned observers, they had created elaborate defensive schemes, and none of it mattered because we had changed the fundamental rules of engagement. That's the real power of innovation in warfare, not just what it allows you to accomplish, but how it renders the enemy's preparations obsolete." Bradley, the radar operator who had narrated that first precision strike through the clouds over Gelsenkirchen, eventually became an electrical engineer after the conflict ended. He worked on early weather radar systems, applying military technology to civilian purposes. "People don't realize how revolutionary that H-2X system was," he reflected near the end of his career. "We weren't just bombing through clouds. We were demonstrating that the limitations people thought were fundamental to aerial warfare, visibility, weather, human eyesight, were actually just temporary constraints waiting for technology to overcome them." The Scholven synthetic fuel facility was eventually rebuilt after the conflict ended, using more modern industrial processes and safety systems informed by the catastrophic failures that had occurred during that March 1944 raid. Engineers examining the damage patterns were struck by the precision of the ordnance placement. "These weren't area saturation strikes," one reconstruction specialist noted. "These were surgical hits on specific pressure vessels, distillation towers, and storage systems. Someone knew exactly what structures to target for maximum disruption, and they hit them through 6,000 meters of solid clouds." Krause, who had survived that initial strike, chose not to return to industrial management after the conflict. "I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness," he explained years later. "Professional competence meant nothing when the sky could open without warning and destroy months of work in seconds. I needed a different kind of work, something where effort and skill produced predictable results." That psychological impact, the erosion of professional confidence, the sense that competence no longer protected against catastrophe, rippled through German industrial and military communities in ways that purely material damage could never achieve. Henderson and Bradley and the other Americans who flew those radar-guided missions weren't just destroying facilities. They were destroying the conviction that experience, expertise, and careful planning could overcome technological disadvantage. The statistical record of radar-guided bombing in the European theater tells its own story. Between March and December 1944, American heavy bombardment groups using H-2X radar systems conducted over 2,000 missions through cloud cover that would have grounded visual bombing operations entirely. Target accuracy rates that had averaged 30% under visual conditions improved to over 70% using radar guidance. Critical industrial capacity was systematically eliminated with a fraction of the ordnance expenditure that traditional area bombing would have required. But beyond the statistics, beyond the tonnage of ordnance delivered and facilities destroyed, the real achievement of radar-guided precision bombing was psychological and strategic. It demonstrated that technological innovation could fundamentally alter the conditions of warfare faster than defensive adaptation could respond. The Germans, who had been so confident that clouds protected their facilities, learned in the most devastating way possible that American engineers had made weather irrelevant. Years after the conflict ended, Henderson was asked whether he felt any satisfaction in having proved Oberst-Vogel wrong about the impossibility of precision bombing through clouds. "I never knew Vogel," Henderson replied. "Never heard his name until researchers told me about his confidence that we couldn't hit his facilities. But I understand his thinking. In early 1944, what we accomplished seemed impossible. It seemed to violate basic principles of physics and aerial warfare. The problem was, those principles weren't as fundamental as he thought. They were just limitations waiting to be overcome, and we overcame them." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.